Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's office hours with the Collective Impact Forum. I'm Jennifer Splansky Jester, Executive Director of the Collective Impact Forum. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope this finds you and your loved ones and your colleagues and community in as good of health as possible these days. Um, I'm dialing in from my basement in Berkeley, California, so you will see some children's artwork and some interesting background, but I know we're all adapting to these virtual times, so it's good to be with everybody. I suspect that many of you might be feeling a bit like I am today. I can say that I am experiencing a mix of uncertainty and overwhelm and fear, but I also am balancing that with a sense of gratitude for my health and my safety and my virtual connections with loved ones and others. So I know that we are all balancing a lot of things right now between our emotions and our health and our work and our families and many things. So just thanks for joining us today. Before we go any further, I want to take a moment to recognize the land that we are on. We'd like to acknowledge that this virtual meeting is being presented and recorded on the traditional land of the Ohlone people, the Potawatomi people, the Coast Salish people, and the Duwamish, past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the Ohlone, Potawatomi, Coast Salish, and Duwamish people. So today's session is the first in a weekly series of office hours that we at the Collective Impact Forum will be holding. We are looking to do these to keep things casual, and we'll walk through questions that you all are asking. There's one caveat that I want to share up front. We do not have all the answers. We are in uncertain times. And what we're really hoping to do is bring our current ideas and thinking based on our own experiences and what we're hearing from many of you all in the field. And we just hope these perspectives can help a bit. So before we dive into our conversation, I just want to do a few housekeeping notes so we can go to the next screen here. Let's see. We are going to be together for about 60 minutes, and this is very Q&A based. So to share questions, you can use the question box on your screen. You can also find access to the slides that will be, we just have a couple slides up front. You can download those from the handout section. And we'll share a recording of today's session after this call. It'll be sent to the email that you registered for this event with. Let's go to the next slide. If you're having technical difficulties, you can put those in the question box, or you can email info@collectiveimpactforum.org. Feel free to also go to Twitter to share what's going on for you during this conversation. Let's go to the next page. So here's a tool that we on our Collective Impact Forum team use to help check in with each other. And this is a practice that we have been doing for a couple of years now. It was created by my colleague, Tracy Timmons Gray, who's actually running the back end of our office hours today. And we use this tool to help us name how we're doing, how we're feeling with our current state of work and these days life. And as you can see here, we have a scale of red down to gray. So red being, we're really feeling a state of overload, and that our priorities may be the only thing that we can get to that day, and we might need some help reprioritizing. We look at orange, that might mean we're very busy juggling priorities, personal and professional are all game for these check-ins, and that we might need to do some course correction or rebalancing. Yellow, we're feeling busy, but we're managing, just keeping an eye on how things are going. Green is the perfect state. So we're feeling a good balance, we're feeling energized and productive, and we have some space to innovate and be creative. Blue is like we're feeling a little bit bored. Maybe our projects aren't that interesting, or we don't actually have that much going on right now. I don't know too many folks who are blue these days, but perhaps. And then gray. Gray is how we describe kind of feeling unfulfilled by our work. It might not be feeling very rewarding or energizing or interesting. So we wanted to share this, and this might be a tool that you all find helpful working with your teams these days. And we also are going to just check in with you all and see how you're feeling today. So Tracy is going to launch a poll, and we'd ask you to let us know, how are you feeling? Red, orange, yellow, green, or blue or gray? So GoToMeeting only allows us to do 5 choices, so we've lumped blue and gray together.
All right, Jen, this is Tracy. We're just going to leave this poll open for just a couple more seconds. I hope everyone can let us know how you're doing. Looks like we're close to 75% of people who've joined us are voting. I'm just going to wait a couple more seconds. All right, I'm going to just close it out in 2 seconds. All right, close and share the results. Great, it looks like so about 6% of our attendees today are in that red category, which hard to focus, feeling overwhelmed, immediate needs only. Around 16% of attendees joining us today are in the orange category. If we're very busy, it's difficult to make course corrections. 54%, so over half of you, are in yellow, hanging in there, busy but still manageable. 13% are green, doing good, feeling positive and productive, that's great. And then about 10% of attendees today are blue or gray, or feeling unfulfilled, unhappy, stuck, or bored. Really appreciate everyone sharing all that today.
Yes, thank you. I would say I'm yellow today, hanging in there. Things are okay. As I don't think I mentioned it, I have a 2 and a 4-year-old, so balancing childcare with preschools closed is good times, but it's also good family time. So that's where I am today. How about you, Paul?
I kind of ended up in the blue-gray zone, and primarily not because the work side, but more just like I feel a sense of malaise, just feeling some sense of worry and sadness and loss, and at the same time feeling like my concentration powers are not what they usually are. So I would
Mm.
say I'm kind of more like I'm not definitely in my productive zone, although for this next hour I'm going to get there.
Right on. So Paul and I are going to be chatting today with your questions. And just as a little bit of background, Paul is a fabulous colleague. He's a senior advisor of the Collective Impact Forum and CEO of the organization Leading Inside Out. He's an author, speaker, trainer, and consultant whose work focuses on areas of leadership development, collaborative culture, racial equity, community engagement, and results-based strategies. So I'm going to turn it over to Paul to share some reflections, and then we'll go over to questions.
Great. Well, hello everyone. I guess following on what I shared earlier, first thing I want to say today is if you don't feel okay, that's okay. If you're actually feeling well, that's cool too. We're all experiencing this differently. And I know we have a global network as well, and we know that's true within the United States. We know that's true globally, that we're all in different places. And if you're just if you're not feeling the most productive or happy or whatever, like that's okay. We all have a lot going on. I'm in my home office today, and finding space for this, I had to figure out where my daughter was taking her college course, where my son was doing his high school Zoom, and where my wife was doing her call. And we're all trying to manage this in different ways. I talked to someone the other day who's a head of a foundation who has to fly across the country and drive a parent back. And so just everyone's got a lot they're dealing with, both with their work and also outside, and just recognizing in these times, like it's okay to feel what you're feeling. And if you're not feeling okay, that's totally cool. And thanks to our friend of the show, so to speak, Vu Lei, who wrote a great column on his blog this week about that. In keeping with that, I wanted to start today by talking about empathy and really thinking about how our empathy skills really have to be at forefront of our work right now. And I like Brene Brown's definitions and work from Dare to Lead, but she talks about empathy as not trying to fix, but trying to be with people and understand their feelings. And she talks about apparently one skill, but it's multiplied 5 times. This is a little conversion from to PDF, I think. But one is really trying to get ourselves into others' perspective and understand where people are coming from. Again, our colleagues, our friends, the people we serve have multiple things going on right now, and not kind of trying to see it from just where your perspective is, but trying to being non-judgmental, recognizing that we often judge people where we feel shame, and to really withhold judgment, to understand what others are feeling and check in on what others are feeling, and communicate that we see and understand what people are feeling. And finally, to try and be a little more mindful, to pay attention and recognize, even when we're on video calls, our body language matters. Like, I've been on video calls with people who it's so clear they're checked out. And so just trying to be mindful and present with people, paraphrasing back, asking questions, share what's coming up, but really making sure we're making those connections. And I keep saying to my family, I have 5 kids, and it's a little rough right now. They're all young adults and teenagers. And I don't think there's any teenager on the planet who says, I hope one day I could spend a couple months just at home with my parents and never see my friends. And so I just know we're all getting on each other's nerves. And I think that empathy in the home, the empathy with work, the empathy with the people we serve, just recognizing everyone's dealing with this differently, and we have to be okay with that. The other thing I think is important at this point is in adaptive leadership, we often talk about getting off the dance floor and onto the balcony, allowing ourselves to kind of get a broader view of what's going on. And I think when things are moving so fast, it can be hard to create that space for ourselves. And some of that balcony space just comes from self-care. And this is not going to be like something that's over in a week or two. It's going to take some time, and to think of it as a relay instead of a sprint. I don't know that it's a marathon, but it's not like this is going to be over fast. And we've got to take care of ourselves, and whatever you can do to create balcony space for yourself, whether it's journaling or meditating or exercise or just taking an hour a day and reading a book or doing a hobby or cooking or checking in with friends and family at night on Zoom or Google Hangout, or checking with peers, not about the work, but about how they're handling the work and how they're making decisions and what they're doing. Create the space for yourself. And I talked to someone the other day who's feeling guilty about turning off their phone twice a day for an hour. And I'm like, no, unplug, do what you need to do so that you can thrive and sustain at these times, and to create space for yourself instead of always being on the dance floor where your ability to make really good longer decisions is limited, to give yourself space to pull back and reflect and be able to see things a little more clearly than when you're in the thick of it. The other thing that came to mind as I thought about today was the Stockdale Paradox. In Jim Collins' classic book, Good to Great, he talks about how Admiral Stockdale, who was a POW in Vietnam, spoke about the people who made it and the people who didn't. And he said that those people who thought they'd be out every Christmas were the people whose hearts got crushed and didn't make it. And the people who survived were those who were very clear about the brutal facts on the ground, and at the same time held ultimate faith they would prevail. And I think we've got to hold this and not have false hopes about what's going to change, but be really clear about what's going on, about what the facts are on the ground for ourselves, for our communities, for the people we serve and our colleagues. Know that we'll get through this, and have that confidence and faith we'll get through this, but not pretend that the facts are different than they are. And it's important that we hold that as leaders in the space. The other thing is to remember kind of the basics of change management. And some of those basics are, again, recognizing everyone has different levels of discomfort. People have very different challenges in their homes, in their lives right now. How do we make space for people, again, to be where they are? To communicate early, clearly, and consistently to make sure that we're letting people know what's going on. When we're making hard decisions, which a lot of us have had to do, disclose how and why those decisions were made, kind of show the math. Don't just announce something, but explain the logic by which you got there. Acknowledge where there's trade-offs and losses and sacrifice happening. We're all sacrificing right now. And really recognize that that's when people are making those trade-offs and losses, or when you're making them, to name them and be clear on them, and clearly describe what change you're making, and figure out how you can give people the most responsibility possible for the change that they can participate in it, so it's not being done to them but with them. Those are kind of some of the basic principles. I want to talk specifically about collective impact, and one of the calls I had today was with the CEO of a community foundation in Jackson, Michigan, and she shared this article from their newspaper, and I thought it was like something that really struck a chord with me in thinking about how we who are doing collective impact can think about this. But she said that the fact that they had all this collaborative infrastructure, the community gave them this infrastructure to really activate when the crisis hit. And the thought that like they had this, and that their backbone is now part of the crisis response team in the community, thinking about how our collective impacts can shift at this time. And in talking to people over the last few days, there's 10 things I've identified that I think collective impact efforts specifically should be thinking about right now in terms of how we support and think about this. And the first is to guess what? Common agenda, schmom and schmagenda. It ain't happening right now for most of you. Like, and that's okay. You're pausing. Like, if someone called me right now to say, like, can we do a meeting on like third grade reading scores this year in the Milwaukee schools? I'd be like, what are you talking about? I'm just trying to get my kids to like figure out how they're going to like what they're going to do every day, right? Like, I think that we have to recognize that right now things in a lot of cases, not in every case, but in a lot of cases are pausing. And our measures and our agenda probably aren't going to be on track for this year, and that's okay. Just like I keep telling my kids, who I have 2 twins who are juniors in high school, who are like, what is this going to mean for like applying to college next year? Like, because we're moving to pass fail and we're not finishing our year. And I'm like, colleges will know that. Everyone's going to know that. Like, everyone knows like there's this asterisk on this point of time. And so if you don't make your measures, no one's going to be like, why didn't you make your measures this year? It's because we're all in this crisis, so it's okay. The second, and this is important to think about, is with the issue you work on, with your collective, are there things you can be doing for your intended beneficiaries right now because they have special needs based on this massive disruption? Are there economic, health, educational, or other needs that they face that you can be thinking or pulling people together to think about how to support them while they're homebound in addressing those things, and to reach out to those folks? The third, also really important, again, focused on your intended beneficiaries, is what vulnerabilities might they have if they get the virus, and how can you prepare and support them? We're seeing in Milwaukee, where I live, that in some of our, there's a lot more cases in the poorer part of our city than others. How can we, if we're collective impact efforts in our communities, be tracking what's going on and thinking about how to prepare and support our most vulnerable populations for this, who might not be as obsessively following the news and everything as some of us are? And so what can we do to support our intended beneficiaries around the virus, not just the work? The fourth is to think about, you know, if you or your colleagues got this virus, what are you going to do? You might get knocked out for 2 weeks. Your colleagues might get knocked out for 2 weeks. If that happens, what contingencies or things can you put in place, or might you need to keep, you know, to keep things going? So just think about and have a plan for what are you going to do? What are you going to do in your home and with your family if one of you gets it? How are you going to quarantine and do the things you need to do? So it's important to be aware of and thinking about that for you and your team, and to make sure your team members are thinking about that too, and have a plan so you don't just lose a lot of people instantly and not have a plan for what's happening. The fifth is how to think about your partners that you're working with and how you can support them. Those who are overwhelmed by demand right now, food banks or shelters or others that are facing specific needs, or educational groups that are trying to figure out how to get stuff into the homes. and others facing financial crisis. I worked with an organization this week that sadly laid off 87% of its staff around the country. And there are organizations that are facing major financial crises. And so being aware of where your partners are and if there's ways you can support or help them right now in that. The 6th and 7th is thinking about what you can do as collective impact right now beyond your common agenda, which is what is it your system leaders in your community right now need? I'm thinking of mayors, health commissioners, county executives, emergency response groups. Like, what might you have incredible skills at facilitation, at recruiting partners and people, at managing system work and multiple things going on at the same time. How might you be able to help them with your skills, capacities, and systems in doing this work? And again, the Jackson, Michigan story comes to mind. The other, and then related to that is, really being aware of your assets and thinking about how can we deploy those assets in support of our community right now. The 8th is about funders, which is everyone should be talking to funders and advocating together for releasing restrictions now. I know one nonprofit I talked to last week, they were looking at borrowing money, but their balance sheet has all these restricted grants on it. And if they could get those unrestricted, then their balance sheet looks a lot better. As I keep saying, the house is on fire, and we have a lot of funders who've said you can't spend our money on hoses and fire extinguishers. And right now we need hoses and fire extinguishers. So we've got to be talking to our grant makers for ourselves and for our partners, and really having that conversation to say that this is the rainy day and it's a hurricane. And this is something you can do right now to give us the flexibility to manage through this so that when we come out of it, we have a chance of building programs instead of taking down organizations as we do this. The 9th, which is the question I was asking at the beginning when I was going through everyone's questions, is once you've figured out how you're going to manage these next several weeks, then start thinking about what you're going to do coming out of this. And thinking about, okay, what are we learning right now? That, because my other guess is that you're going to learn some things in this kind of new environment that might reshape how you think about your common agenda going forward. You might have to do some new work on it. But you're going to have to think about, okay, so how do we adapt our goals and measures and things for the year and going forward? And again, recognize that everyone in the world's dealing with this, so no one's going to be shocked or surprised that you've had to make changes. But you're going to have to do some refiguring. And I think in a lot of communities, there's going to be a need and a desire for people to help and to figure out how to get involved with things. And there's going to be a need to kind of get things moving again. So be ready for that. But after you've kind of dealt with the fact that for the next several weeks, you've got to figure out how to kind of take care of things within the current environment, then you can start thinking about what's the middle term where we come out of this and start to move toward our agenda. And then finally, of course, be empathetic and patient with colleagues' pace and productivity. Everyone's dealing with different things, and you can't expect people to be the way they normally have been in your work. So anyways, that's my 10 pieces of advice right now for collective impact efforts. And I'm going to turn it to Jennifer to move us to questions and she's gathered some from those you've submitted before, and then we'll take some live as well. All right, let's go.
Thanks, Paul. So maybe let's just build on one of the last points you were mentioning around engaging with funders. So you're suggesting that folks think about approaching funders to loosen some restrictions or encouraging funders to do that. I actually want to say someone put in the chat box here that she's a funder, and she said what's really resonating with her decision makers, it sounds like, awesome, you're having these conversations already, is what specifically needs to be waived or changed, and how does it affect individuals, not the funded organizations? So I take that to mean sort of end beneficiaries. So I wanted to share that and see if you have any comments. And Paul, just another clarifying question. Someone wanted a little more clarity on what you mean when it says to remove restrictions on funds from funds or funders.
Great. So what I was meaning is that for grants that have restrictions on them, typically program-related grants that have minimal money for general operating support and are for specific programs, So I'll give this example, which is if you're funding a program that serves schools and schools are closed, you're not going to be able to do that program right now, right? But if you lay everybody off because you can't do that program and you're not going to be able to draw down those resources because you're not doing that program right now, when things come back in the fall, you're not going to be prepared to serve those children again. And so the question is, how do you keep the organization funded and supported to sustain through this crisis so they can serve the intended beneficiaries down the line? And maybe they also, in the interim, figure some ways, as we talked about earlier, to work with and help intended beneficiaries in the near term, but they're not going to be delivering programs through schools. No one's doing door-to-door outreach right now, right? Like if you're got a grant to do like neighborhood outreach, you're not doing that right now. And so I think the thing is to really have honest conversations about funders, and I think for funders, you got to release a little bit of ego with it too, and just recognize that for this period of time, giving groups maximum flexibility to keep the lights on, keep people employed, keep programs ready, so when we come out of this, they can continue serving is important. And if you don't, organizations may get decimated, at which point they're not going to be able to serve people when this comes out. So
Yeah.
it's really creating that flexibility to give nonprofit leaders right now the maximum flexibility possible. It would be insane right now if the money going to companies and small businesses was saying you can only spend it on this or that. Like we got to give people flexibility right now to keep the lights on and to spend it on the operating and personnel costs that are important so that they can come out of this with a plan. And I think organizations can talk about what they're going to do to build and support during this time. But everyone's got to be patient with each other, and donors have to be super empathetic with what nonprofits are facing right now who don't have endowments, who don't have the kind of assets and things they can fall on. They've got like a lot of them are hand to mouth.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think some folks have commented here that we do actually nationally see a lot of funders having this conversation, which is very promising. The Council on Foundations has created they call it a call to action. It's a pledge for funders that they have over 370 foundations have like accepted this pledge. So I know, credit to many funders on the line and
Yes,
many in the country
absolutely.
that are absolutely going there. And
Yeah.
encouragement of folks to, for those who are grantees to have those conversations with your funders. And it could be about getting timelines pushed back. It could be about loosening strings on, restricted funds. It could be
Absolutely.
reducing measurement or reporting requirements that are
Yep.
going to feel additively burdensome right now. But
The
anyways,
Ford, the Ford Foundation has a great resource that a lot of the work is based on that lists all the things they've done, which is a great list, which a lot of the things Jennifer just shared are on. And there's also a pledge a bunch of national funders have taken, but a lot of you are funded by local donors. We need those local donors to do the same things.
yeah, great. Um, so we also have a bunch of questions coming in, and that came in before around one of the more kind of tactical pieces of collective impact, which is facilitating meetings. And many of us are very used to the art of creating and designing and facilitating in-person meetings so that they're productive and engaging. And of course, we are now in a virtual environment. So we wanted to just give a space to share some advice on
Yeah.
doing effective virtual meetings. And I will say, I think most people in the country now have at least heard of Zoom. There's Zoom, there's GoToWebinar, there's Google Hangouts there. I think that's
Right.
the easy part, like the technology fix. I shouldn't say it's the easy part because there are communities that don't have internet access and technology. But there is that technical part. But perhaps we could spend more of our time on like the part of like how to think about designing good meetings and adapting that into a virtual environment.
Yeah, I think the same principles that guide really good meetings on the ground also work online with a few variations. And um, with the tech that's available, and most people have smartphones if they don't have computers, and Zoom and those things and Google Hangout all work on phones as well. The first thing is to be really crystal clear about what are the results we want to walk out of a meeting with, and have real clarity about what the meeting purpose and results are. The second is there's got to be one person facilitating, and facilitating actively. You can't facilitate sitting back and kind of like letting it go. Someone's got to hold the energy of the meeting. We all know that video and conference calls like really can lose energy, and someone's got to keep that momentum moving. I'm a big believer in calling on people, and not just opening a question up and like seeing who takes it, because what happens is no one wants to jump in, or multiple people jump in, or like it's much easier in a way to kind of call on people, or if you've got a larger group, to use something like a chat space to have people kind of raise their hands, or to on certain things roll call and just have each person kind of share what they're thinking, but really to move around and make sure you're not creating that dead air. The other thing is that at the end of each meeting, reviewing like what were the decisions made, what are the next steps, what's going to happen, how we did on our results. Just again, a lot of the normal things that make meetings work. The other thing I'll say is what I've found in the last few weeks, because I've been working with clients who've got larger in-person meetings, they're trying to move online, is breaking it up into, I think that for generative work, I think of it the same way I think about tables when we do larger events, is if we put 6 to 8 people at a table, 6 to 8 people on like a generative webinar is a lot and creates space for much higher engagement. And I'd rather do 3 2-hour meetings with 8 people than 1 2-hour meeting with 24 people. And I feel I'll get a lot more out of it if I'm doing generative work. If I'm just reporting back, or it's like not very generative, I can do a larger group. But if we're really trying to solve problems together, or through things together in a deeper way, I think a smaller group, just like the number of people you could put around a table, is about the right size. And to utilize some of the features. The other thing I'll just say is really encouraging people to use the video portion. I know that some people want to be in their jammies, and that's fine. Like, be in your jammies, like do what you need to do. I did not wear a bow tie today. But I think it does help in keeping people engaged. When people are audio only, there's the temptation to look at email, to read other things, to be doing other stuff. When they're on video, they're much more likely to be active and engaged in the conversation. And so it just increases the kind of connection, makes it more personal with each other and the rest. So those are some things. I also think just if you're one of the resources, one of our partners, another friend of the show, the Tamarack Institute has guidelines for working remotely that have made their way around, and it's a great resource based on their experience that a lot of people have found helpful in thinking about this new environment, who aren't used to it the way many of us are, who work mostly remotely anyways. So those are some of the things I think about.
Yeah, a couple of things I would just add, and some of these are from my experience, and thanks, some folks have been putting things in the question box here. So establishing like team norms or virtual meeting norms as a team, so that those are co-created, can be really helpful. In addition, it can be helpful to have someone monitoring like the chat window. If you're like really actively facilitating, maybe have someone else that's monitoring the chat, and encouraging in many situations folks to use the chat. That can be really helpful. I've also run meetings and seen meetings where you might have like a webinar or a Zoom open, and then you also have a shared like Google Doc that everyone can input their ideas into and brainstorm in real time, and then kind of +1 each other, and you can do all sorts of kind of co-creation that way. Paul, I'm not sure if you mentioned Zoom has the breakout room feature. So
I haven't used that yet.
Yeah, it works really well. So you can have a meeting that has, let's say, 25 people in it, but then when it's time for small group conversations, you can either assign or randomly put people into breakout rooms so they can have smaller, more intimate conversations. And those breakout rooms really do serve like, the technology works amazingly well, and people can then just be brought back into the full group almost very seamlessly. And so that's another really helpful thing that you can do via Zoom. So, some of these are technology, some of them are meeting design related. Another thing that I think we've just been experimenting with in our organization is balancing having kind of productive time as a team. And then for those of you that are going from being co-located to being remote, finding ways to build culture and community virtually as well. And some of that is we have found is helpful to like find ways to have fun or do something enjoyable together virtually. So that could be listening to some music together, or it could be, if you're Paul, or it could be playing some online video games together. We were just experimenting with an app called House Party. And so just finding ways to connect interpersonally if people have time and interest. There are some really great technology enabled ways to do that. One other point I'll say that someone put in the chat that I want to recognize is that there are situations where people may not feel comfortable doing video if they don't feel comfortable showing their home, or for religious reasons, like they're not wearing, they wear a headscarf in public but not wearing one at home. So appreciate that comment and wanted to just mention that.
And I think when you mentioned the group norms, I think it's establishing norms. I think I do think though that to the best extent possible, having people visually will create more productivity, but certainly you have to make accommodation and be flexible, because people, again, based on their own background, but also based on the reality of things they're dealing with, might not be able to, and that's okay.
Yeah.
We gotta all just make room for each other.
A couple requests to mention the guide to working remotely. That's from the Tamarack Institute. And Tracy, maybe you could put that in the chat, spell that out in the chat window.
Great.
Terrific. Okay, let's see. So lots of questions coming in. Let me ask you this, Paul. How can we think about raising up the voices of community in these times of change to be sure we're really meeting folks' needs?
Well, I think that the best way, so we're limited, right? And so I think the best way is reaching out. And whether it's checking in with intended beneficiary families in some way, or if it's monitoring data in the community and contacting people from different communities to see what they're hearing. And I think there's ways you can check in with folks that you're able to communicate with and lift those up and make sure that, again, if you think about the people your project serves, what mechanisms or organizations or partners, or do you have that contact yourself, can check in with people and hear about what some of their needs and interests are, and be able to convey that up to the systems that need to be serving or helping with those things. Like, I think that's a great way to do it. And maybe using social media to create groups, or going to where people might already be to create space to hear from people and connect. And so think about maybe, could you create a Facebook group around something, or can you, do you have contacts, and can you split it up among your employees to just call a subsection of intended beneficiaries and check in on how they're doing and what needs they're facing, and be able to then aggregate that in some way and bring that to the system leaders you have access to. So I think there are some ways you can reach out. It's going to be harder because, again, I would argue that a lot of community folks probably have less experience using these platforms, but then again, many of them also are using things like Google Hangout, the younger ones, and some to touch base with family and others. So realizing smartphones are probably the best carrier of information as well.
Thanks. Thank you. So going back to something you shared earlier, Paul, where you were talking about the value in getting up on the balcony. How would you recommend to someone who is in the red on our color spectrum? How would you recommend they find space to get up on the balcony when people are focused on such immediate needs in the crisis?
I think the thing to do is to figure out what boundary you can create for yourself and be okay with taking it. Um, and when we get on the plane, they tell us to put on our own oxygen mask before we put on everyone else's. And if you burn out or get sick and end up out for a couple weeks, you're going to help people a lot less than if you sustain yourself through this. And so I think you just have to. I went through a period back in 2003 where my organization, which operated in 23 cities around the country, our federal funding got eliminated. And I had just had twins 6 weeks before, or I didn't, my wife did, but it was, my organization was in crisis. I was actually supposed to be on leave, and I just had to build boundaries around it, and we got through that. But it really taught me a lesson about sometimes we can maintain our productivity, but it's okay to unplug and say, okay, from like 7 to 9 a.m. and 7 to 9 p.m., like that's my family time or my like rest time or whatever, and I'm holding that. But the rest of the day I'm yours, and just create those boundaries where you can. And if you're in an emergency situation where you're dealing with life or death issues, that might be harder, but can you then delegate out or kind of among your team, kind of make sure everybody gets a break each day where they get to pull back and do what they need to do? I just think it's really important because sustaining yourselves through this is going to be rough, and it's not going to be just a couple of weeks. It could be a couple months, and so finding that space to keep yourselves healthy when this is a pandemic that's about health, and our own health matters in being able to care for the health of our communities.
Yeah.
Mental and otherwise, mental and physical health matter.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll make better decisions if you can get out of the red zone, if you can get yourself more balanced, you'll be more productive and make better decisions and more thoughtful decisions. And recognizing the last week and a half has been impossibly fast for all of us, but at some point we've got to find our balance within it. So like anyone who didn't find balance last week, no shit, no one found balance last week. Information was changing every 6 hours, right? But now we've got to start figuring out where do we find our balance and how do we hold that through this medium term that we're going to go through.
Yeah. And I love the analogy you started with the put your mask on before helping others. I think that's quite relevant. So
I'm not hearing that much these days since I canceled 12 trips already.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
I'm used to that announcement, but I'll be unused to it in a couple months.
Yes, many of us are not flying. Well, none of us are flying in the same way we are accustomed to. Hopefully not too long. Let's see. So lots of good questions here. So how can organizations that are part of a collective team to act collectively when a crisis hits, given the bandwidth complexities? There's a need to be organized and walk in alignment more than ever. At the same time, it's much harder to do so. I think that is bandwidth illustrative.
Yeah. So again, I think that it's being clear on what's everybody's situation. What are the different partners need right now? What does your populations need right now? And thinking about how do we organize ourselves for the now? And again, there may be partners who have very specific needs right now, and can some of you help them? And there might be other organizations that have slack right now because they have a community center and no one's coming, but they've got some resources, they're not laid off. So how can they be supportive even from home? Again, and checking in on people virtually, or getting information to folks, or helping fill in information for an organization that's trying to track a lot of information about need that's out there. I mean, like, find out like what your partners need and figure out how to deploy and organize your resources for the best maximum support of your intended beneficiaries right now. That would be and it's hard, and everyone's in different places, but my guess is there are some that are in the red and some that are not, and figure out kind of how to help those in the red pull back. And not get too, and that's where that flexibility of funding comes in, is not being so focused on like your own, or like if your organizations can hold for a little bit but doesn't have as much to do, how do you deploy to others who can do that? I talked to someone whose husband works at a nonprofit that's not doing much, but they've got money for salaries, and it's like, why aren't they like being activated for others? Like, let's get past the organization as a construct, and collective impact creates that opportunity. So I think really figuring out kind of where people are and figuring out how to kind of pull people together. And again, looking at the needs over the next couple of months for our intended beneficiaries and our partners.
Yeah. So interesting comment question here. So someone says that they're seeing a lot of companies. So is there an opportunity to leverage the existing crisis to advocate for things? And I'm really glad that you bring this up, Andrea, who put in this question. We're seeing a lot of companies making commercials and adverts acknowledging the crisis and letting people know that we're here for you, or whatever language they're using. Won't the same work for our collective impact ideas? Additionally, if it is health related specifically, can't we use the sense of immediacy to our advantage, or would this come across as disingenuous? If oil companies and airlines can get bailed out, why not us, right? So Paul, go ahead. I have some thoughts too.
Yeah, I mean, my first thought is that in the longer term, people remember how people acted in the crisis. And I don't think a lot of people are swayed by ads by companies right now saying we're all really nice and please give us $5 billion, right? Nonprofits are in the legislation the Senate passed last night. A lot of the small business opportunities that are focused on 500 or fewer employees, including loans that turn into grants and things like that to keep rent, employees, and utilities paid, is available to nonprofits and will be forgiven. And so there will be resources available to organizations, just as there are that people who itemize will be able to actually donate $300 and have it be tax deductible on top of their standard itemization. I mean, their standard deduction, whereas right now you can only deduct if you itemize your deductions. Non-itemizers can now give $300 to a nonprofit and take that as a deduction on top of their standard. There are things within the bill that helps nonprofits that you can leverage. I think that making a case for here's what we can do to help, I think it's better to be helpful in the crisis than to kind of advertise yourself by the crisis. And again, I'm not sure that the implications of what's being asked, but I think that I would recommend focus on actions more than promotion, and taking actions that will position you to be seen as a real asset in the community. And as I said, when you see that headline from Jackson, Michigan saying their collaborative muscle has made this happen, and everyone in the community is seeing that the reason why their emergency response is working well is because this collective impact effort kind of created an infrastructure they could ride on, that's going to do more for their collective impact long term than if they had created an ad.
Yeah.
Jennifer?
Yeah, no, in addition to that, I think that all makes sense. And I think another way that I was interpreting this question was also like, there are some changes in our community that we now have like a window of opportunity for, that the collective impact is really well positioned to pursue. Maybe not today, but in the like medium to longer term. Like, what are the policy or system change opportunities that there might now actually be a new window for, that our collaboratives are really well positioned to be pursuing? Our collective impact forum colleague Junius Williams has been, we were just having a conversation with Junius about this, and stay tuned for some additional thinking here. But I think that part of we hope the power that these, this is like the Jackson example, there's kind of the power in the crisis moment that a collaborative can have, but also what new opportunities that are kind of consistent with the mission of your collaborative are going to present themselves as we begin to come out the other side. I think that makes a lot of sense.
And I think people will understand more about public health today than they did 2 months ago. Things like universal basic income now is actually going to be attempted at a mass scale in the United States. There are a lot of things that we can pull from this to bring into our advocacy. I think that's not a problem. I just would be careful in the next 2 months and really focus on being helpful, and then really doing that plan as I wrote in step 9 of really thinking about, like, okay, now how do we adapt our strategy? And I think leveraging some of the lessons from this experience, absolutely good, and you should. And I think you'll learn things that will be incredibly helpful to your process going forward.
Great. So another question here. So a few months ago, someone was tasked with starting a new interdepartmental public policy team. Even though policy priorities are shifting because of the pandemic, they're still getting pressure to start the group. How might you suggest balancing expectations for something new without being tone deaf to how things are shifting now and the capacity it requires the folks that would be on the team?
Maybe what you could do is survey the members of the team about what their bandwidth is to take it on, and to whoever is holding the expectation that you're going to move this in the near term, bring that data back. And maybe what you hear is people are like, yeah, we want to think about this right now because we're stuck at home and I'm tired of playing Minecraft with my son, or whatever it is. Or maybe they're saying, like, we're all in the red, we have no bandwidth to think about this. But then you can actually base it on hearing from your committee members and bring that up, and then adjust expectations based on their actual ability to meet and work on it. I've seen some people respond to this in different ways, but I've seen there's work I'm doing right now in a couple cities where people are still wanting to come together and talk about stuff and plan, and there's others where people are like, we can't do this right now. So I think just reach out to the people and ask what the bandwidth is, and then bring that back to, and then shift expectations based on actual real data about bandwidth from the people you're working with.
That's good advice, good advice. So I think I'm going to make this the last question. And Paul, we have, what recommendations do you have for other CI models that are for other CI models working on public health issues, in particular, worried about limited stakeholder capacity because so many of our key leaders are healthcare workers? Is there anything you're seeing from conversations you're having?
I think just like recognize that there's one focus right now, and that there are issues related to that, and you'll have to kind of balance that in. But I think that again, don't be in a narrow tunnel of what's my agenda. Be in a place of community health and think about, like, are there things you're seeing that maybe the leaders focused on this are missing that could be additional health concerns? I was last week working with a bunch of coalitions that are working on behavioral health, and there was an effort that the NAMI in Madison, Wisconsin was leading to get our governor to create a Medicaid waiver for telecounseling so that people could do that. Insurance companies have done that for the insured, but for Medicaid didn't have that ability. And so they needed to do that so that people who had mental health issues. So again, that's being aware of what the needs are of your intended beneficiaries and taking action on them. And I think that just holding that within the health space is important, and being aware of kind of like, are there needs our population are facing, going back to the second thing I mentioned, and how can you be addressing those? And then again, like, how can you be helpful to the public health folks in your city who are working on the crisis? What information, knowledge, experience, or relationships can you bring to help them with your most vulnerable populations? And so I wouldn't be focused so much, again, on the exact content of your work, except for where you see those special needs flaring up, like the opportunity for people to get counseling who have, this is not a good time for people who suffer from depression and anxiety, right? It's just not. And I have that in my own family, and it's been hard to address. And we're fortunate that some of our providers are providing medicine in terms of mental health. And it's important right now. So, and I think there's other issues within the public health sphere where you may see other needs that people are going to have in their homes, and be thinking about how to work with the systems to make sure those things are dealt with too.
That's helpful. Thank you, Paul. So that is our last question for today. So I want to, Paul, say thank you. I hope that you're able to join us for another one of our weekly office hours in the coming weeks. As I mentioned, we're going to be doing these once a week for the coming weeks as we work our way through the COVID-19 crisis. A couple other notes we just wanted to mention. So Paul, if I could ask you to go down to the next slide. For those that are interested in a deeper learning experience at the Collective Impact Forum, we've transitioned what was going to be our in-person convening in May in Minneapolis to be a virtual convening. So the good news is we can all join this from our own homes. So we have a link to this on our website, and we'll include a link to more information on the virtual convening when we send follow-up information. But these are the exact kind of conversations that we want to be having in our virtual format as well. So wanted to let folks know about of that opportunity to continue learning with us. And
I'll be there.
Paul will be there. I'll be there.
I'll be there, probably wearing exactly this, but I'll be there.
And we have terrific speakers lined up and lots of great practitioners sharing the work they're doing from across the country, ready to share through this convening. So really looking forward to that. And then just on the next slide, wanted to let everyone know that the Collective Impact Forum has launched a podcast that is available for streaming on your favorite podcast platform. And we have 7 podcasts up right now, and we'll be continuing to release them as time goes forward. Some are chats that we do specifically for the podcast. We've also turned many past keynotes from amazing speakers into audio format, so you can listen to keynotes from past Collective Impact Forum convenings. So welcome you to check that out and subscribe on your favorite platform. So with that, I want to thank you all for joining us. And Paul, thank you for your thoughts today. Always great to chat with you. We have lots of folks saying thank you, Paul, for this in our chat window here, our Q&A window, excuse me. So really, really thanks for all for joining, and best health and safety to everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Stay safe and take care, and be well. I'll be here next Thursday at the same time, same bad channel. So hopefully have some new things to share and learn from all of you. Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.